Welcome to Decoding Leadership, where we break down the intersection between humane and effective leadership. I'm your host, Jade Verbick. Today we talk with Keizan Shaffer about a variety of topics, including mentorship, sponsorship, career advice, and reorgs. It was a fascinating discussion, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it with you. Welcome to the show. Today we have Keizan, and he's here to talk with us about mentorship for leaders. So Keizan, can you tell us a little bit about what you mean when you say mentorship?
Yeah, it's a great question. I do a lot of mentorship. I do a lot of coaching, and coaching is part of my business. And I feel like mentorship is an important part of really just functioning as a human. I think it's apropos that you and I are talking about mentorship because you were one of my mentors early on at
that's nice to hear.
New Relic. Yeah, absolutely. I very distinctly remember multiple instances in which you would say things like, hey, I see you doing X. Based on my experience, and especially my knowledge of this organization, I think things are going to turn out better for you if you do Y.
Oh, interesting.
It's a lot for me. I think that's a lot of what differentiates mentorship from coaching or even training or teaching is that it really leans a lot on your own personal experience. And it can look different if it's organization specific or not, right? So that was an example of one where it's like, hey, I know this organization and also I know engineering management better than you do. I think we should probably tell the audience when we started working together, that was my first job ever as an engineering manager. So there was a combination of like, hey, this is just like leadership 101 stuff. And also like, I know the players that are involved and let me tell you, but yeah, a lot of my mentorship work tends to be pretty personal, right? Pretty much like this is personally what's worked for me and your mileage may vary, but I can tell you that this succeeded. And I can also tell you I tried to do that exact thing that you're doing right now and it did not work well for me.
When do you think it's appropriate to use coaching versus mentorship?
On my website, I talk about coaching and advising, and it's like a continuum, right? Part of it is what is someone asking for?
Yeah.
There's sometimes that people are asking for advice and sometimes people are not. It also has to do with your domain specific knowledge. You know, there are times that I will coach people that I have never done their job. Yeah. Right. Or there are particular challenges that they're addressing that I'm not familiar with. And that's when I tend to lean on more of the kind of classic Socratic method that is associated with coaching. Another important piece that I've gotten from coaching and that's been coming up a lot more for me as I talk to other people who coach is training, which is also something a lot of mentors are not necessarily going to be training you. It may not be something that they're particularly good at or they want to do. They really just want to, take some time to share their experience with you. I tend to give a lot more mentorship and a lot more advice, but that's the relationship. So you have more experience doing this than I do, and I want to learn from you. But there's always crossover. I've been in situations where I am advising someone and it's a totally novel situation to me. And so I don't want to just make something up. Yeah. So then I'll lean into the coaching. And at the same time, I can be coaching someone in a domain that I'm not experienced with. But if the problem is just general communication challenges or inner office,
politics or whatever.
Yeah, I can definitely then still advise and lean on my experience.
One thing I've found with mentorship is it's very context dependent. And that is sometimes difficult when you're mentoring somebody because you have to make sure that the advice that you're giving somebody is very pertinent to their situation. Yeah. And so I sometimes find that it feels like working on problems together where it's, I have all this experience to lean on, but you know your situation way better than I do.
Right.
How have you navigated that especially when you do have a lot of relevant experience, but sometimes applying it, you have to be careful too to know when to apply what.
So there's a couple aspects of that. One is sometimes you do need to use the Socratic method to make sure that you understand the situation. Yeah. You don't want to overfit, right? Be like, oh, I have this preconceived notion that this is similar to this thing that I experienced before. And then you start to get like confirmation bias and you ignore the details.
Yeah.
So you want to definitely come in curious and ask questions before you draw on your personal experience. There's the other element that you touched on around when is it appropriate, when it's not appropriate. And this is something that I think has come up a lot for me, especially when I'm doing career development work with people, is that there have been times when I've seen something that, based on my personal experience or with other people that I've done career development with, I'm like, oh, this is the thing, right? You're totally the perfect fit to do this. You should totally go into project management or whatever it is. Yeah. That almost never works. For me personally, to project what I think is a great idea onto someone else's career almost never works. Someone needs to have a lot of agency, just a really high level of agency, because it's hard, right? Making career changes is hard. And so then I tend to ask a lot of questions, and sometimes they can be leading questions, and I might make some subtle suggestions, but I back way off in those kinds of situations.
That makes sense.
And that's just one example. Anytime that it's going to be something really hard and it's going to require a lot of agency, it should be more of a collaborative problem-solving process, because someone really needs to own that solution and even own the process to some extent.
What shaped your approach to how you mentor people?
One of the biggest deciding factors is it someone who reports to me or not?
Yeah.
One of the things that inspired me to propose this topic in the first place is I had some interesting experiences mentoring some engineering managers that reported to me at my last full-time job. And I changed my approach really pretty dramatically over the course of those couple of years. And I think in the beginning you asked, is this about being a leader and mentoring or mentoring for leaders? And the answer is both. Especially in this particular case, it was really interesting for me to be a leader and mentor leaders. And what I ended up doing is I ended up being very, very transparent and very explicit about the why of everything that I did. So I'd be in a conversation with someone and they'd ask me something and I say, this is what I suggest. And then like really not just say, and these are the reasons why, but go meta a little bit and be like, this is my thought process, and really explain my thought process of how I got from A to B. And not just when they were asking me questions, basically any time that I made a decision and I was rolling that out to managers, I would be very explicit around what my decision-making process was, because a lot of these people were new managers and, I just wanted them to benefit from the trial and error of figuring out how to make these kinds of decisions.
I love that, because I think sometimes mentorship is about, really, it's almost training. You're training somebody how to think about problems, and by really exposing your thought process, you're allowing them to kind of walk through kind of look over your shoulder as you problem solve and help them kind of view things in the way that you view them. It's a real gift, I think.
Early on in my management career, I felt much more comfortable mentoring people who didn't report to me, because I felt a strong conflict of interest when I was mentoring people who reported to me. It's like, this might be the best thing for you, but this is what I really need out of you right now, kind of thing.
Yeah.
I think that's become less problematic for me as I've just matured into the role and been able to hold both of those things, comfortably and naturally. But I also have started to appreciate some of the superpowers that come from mentoring someone who reports to you, and that deep level of context of really sharing those decisions and sharing those challenges is part of it. And then delegation is another superpower there. And I love your article about the completed staff work. And I've shared a lot of your articles with a lot of people over the years. And that's one, actually someone else who did not know that I knew you. One of my managers sent that one to me. It was like, because I was talking to her about delegation and kind of the superpower of delegation, especially if you're a manager managing managers.
Yeah.
Right? Because that line of who's responsible for what can be really flexible. It can really move a lot.
Yeah. And
so there's a lot of what you might find you would consider yourself to be responsible for that you can make someone else's responsibility, and vice versa. Yeah, it's interesting where we're playing on different sides of the same line, where one is, I'm going to keep responsibility for this, but I'm going to be really explicit with you as to how and why I'm doing what I'm doing. Or you can move to the other side and say, I'm going to ask you to do this. And I'm going to ask you to be really transparent with me.
About how you go about it.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. I love using delegation as a way of building people's skills. And you can calibrate how big of chunks of work, how much they can take and run with things before they report back. Like, it's a really interesting leadership space, I think.
Yeah. It's a lot harder to do well than it seems at first. So I learned a lot of stuff from a lot of different leaders at New Relic about delegation. So is it okay if we go on a little tangent here?
Totally. Yeah, definitely.
So one of my favorite things, so Darren Swanson once told me, delegation should not be about no longer doing a thing that you don't want to do, but about what's the thing that you're not doing that you should be doing. And then it becomes pretty natural, like what's the lowest priority thing that you're doing right now that like could go to somebody else. And I don't know if he's ever used that NASCAR driver analogy with you.
I don't think so. Tell me about it.
So apparently when NASCAR drivers are training, they'll put a piece of cardboard over the bottom half of their windshield so that they're not looking at the turn that they're in right now. They're always looking at the next turn.
Oh, wow. That's brilliant.
Right. And so he was saying, if you're spending too much of your time and energy on the turn that you're in right now, those are things that you should consider delegating so that you can focus your energy on the next turn. What's 6 months out as opposed to what's happening right now. And then Alex Croman also, I had, I think, done a pretty poor job of delegating something to one of my managers, and it basically just delegated tasks.
Yeah.
And he said, you should never delegate tasks. You delegate projects, and there should be clear success criteria, and let them figure out the solution. And it was definitely.
I always was so impressed with how Alex almost would delegate hard things to people. He would make some people responsible for like doing something really difficult. And it was like he pointed people at problems in a way that I just found unusually effective. And I definitely tried to emulate.
Yeah. I think it's some of that same magic that we talked about in terms of when you're doing career development with people and they have to have agency.
Yeah.
I think he was good at presenting challenges and letting people have agency around tackling those challenges.
Yeah, I think so. I think for me, sometimes I found it difficult to delegate to people because it felt selfish. And so I would be like, they've got all these other things on their plate and I can do this job really well. So it just doesn't seem necessary sometimes. I have the bandwidth to do it. Why don't I just do it? I think one thing that kind of switched my perspective on it was when I realized that I could really use delegation to help people grow, and that essentially, yes, I should be thinking at the next point of the curve. For them, career-wise, they should be thinking about bigger problems and solving bigger problems. And if I can identify the most high-impact ways to leverage people, that grows their capabilities and the type of problems that they can tackle.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there's something really subtle around the fact that if you're doing the things that you're really good at, you're also to some extent staying in your own comfort zone.
Yeah.
Right. As opposed to letting go of these things that you're good at to go to that uncomfortable place that's on the other side of the horizon.
Absolutely.
It's something I talk about a lot with people when they say like, well, like what should I be focusing my energy on if I want to advance my career? And my response almost always involves, what's the thing that you haven't already proven that you're good at, right? Like clearly you did project X and Y, and they really showed that you have these skills and behaviors and you show them consistently. It's just like always be looking for what's the thing that you haven't shown that you're consistently good at, or shown that consistent behavior. And it's almost never going to be something that you're good at because you're good at it because you've been doing it.
That's really good advice. I've typically thought about that in terms of a couple things. One is, how can you make it a rational choice for you to be doing the things that you're not doing today? Like, why would somebody think that they would have the most confidence in you doing that as opposed to like somebody else? That's one piece of advice. I think I also learned that from Alex Croman. And another is I've also found it useful to always be thinking about the next level of abstraction above where you're working. So if you're working on a project, like how can you make projects in your area of the organization better? How can you, whenever you're doing your work, make the next level easier or better or faster or cheaper in some dimension? And I've found that tends to lead to opportunity because you're basically making things better you're generalizing your benefits.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think to bring it back to mentorship a little bit, I think that's a really powerful thing that a mentor can do is show people how they can expand their scope.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
It's not always clear when you're in a situation, what is the next level?
Yeah.
And what does that look like? I've used this talk a couple times, especially with really senior individual contributors, is there's a difference between doing work that's leverageable and work that is leveraged.
Oh, interesting. Can you explain that?
Right. So for example, I was working with someone who had gone to the work of developing this really great library that had the potential to really make everyone's lives a lot better, but nobody was really using it. And then someone else picked it up and started evangelizing it and got a lot of recognition for that.
Oh,
And I can see why you're frustrated that you're not getting the recognition for this, but the work that you had done, unfortunately, was actually not being leveraged. So you weren't really bringing much value.
yeah. You made it possible but you didn't take it all the way.
Yeah. And sometimes it takes being at that broader scope to have that visibility. And even if you're not working in the same organization, even if you're mentoring someone that's in another organization, just having been through that enough times to be like, I bet if you look at it from this angle, right? I bet if you went to your boss or someone in some other team and asked them X, Y, and Z, you would find that things weren't being leveraged to the extent that they really could be, or that you're not having the broadest scope of impact that you could potentially have.
So another term I've heard for this is that your mentors are like your guides to the terrain. They've been there, they're very familiar with it. They can show you the lay of the land and help you understand the local customs, the way to think in that part of the world. It's a sort of guiding function.
Kind of the metaphor of a guide in a foreign land, I think, is helpful, especially when you're working with people who are new to their role, whether it's a leadership role or not. Anytime someone is new to a role, it's just like, whoa, like, I don't even know.
Yeah.
I don't even know. Yeah. I don't even know which way to go. Yeah, just having that calming influence of the person who's just like, hey, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
And let's narrow down a little bit, but also, again, continue to give you the agency to choose your path within that kind of narrower range.
How prescriptive do you think a mentor should be? Like, are there times when you should just tell people, or like, how have you balanced that?
It depends on the person, to be honest. I love to be in a mentorship relationship where I can be prescriptive when I need to be. It's one of the reasons why I feel like I've had more success as a mentor when that relationship has come about organically, especially if we're talking about mentorship relationships where it's not someone who's reporting to you, because it's like people who are comfortable with each other gravitate towards each other and kind of form this relationship. And I think there's just like a higher level of psychological safety there, and it allows you to be much more direct and honest. I think there's a lot to be said for more formalized programs where mentors and mentees are chosen. I think you probably have much higher rate of participation in those kinds of situations, but I probably get more coaching and training in that, and a lot less of like really directive, like, hey, like, I see where this is going and I'm worried for you. I'm honestly personally worried for you in where this is going, right? It's when I'm prescriptive with people in that situation, it tends to be less of the like, you really should do this, and more of the like, you should really not do that thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I know what you're talking about. Why do you think it is that in some companies, mentorship is disparaged or looked down upon or viewed as not focusing on results, or do you know what I mean? Like sometimes it seems very soft or
yeah. I think people have had bad experiences with it, or they maybe view it as being a more passive process. And early in my career, I actually ran into a lot of resistance from people around Agile for similar reasons, that they basically had an experience where someone was doing it wrong, and they had that really bad association. And I think there's actually probably some similarities in how you can do mentorship wrong and how you can do Agile wrong. I think the people who've been burned by Agile, it was someone who was like really rigid, and this is the one way and we will do it exactly this way, and not being able to flex for the situation and really change approach and maybe use a totally different approach. Or the same thing is true with mentorship. Probably the best and definitely the longest running mentorship relationship I have right now has evolved into something where we're mentoring each other.
Yeah.
And that's not how it started. It started out with someone saying to me, hey, like you've been in the position that I want to be in.
Yeah.
Please mentor me so that I can get into that position. And then they eventually achieved that. And we didn't say, oh, mission accomplished, we're done now. It became much more of a give and take. And I think that if people are in a situation where the mentor is like the teacher and they're going to hand down their years of experience to you, that's not helpful. You offline had put in something around sponsorship, which I actually think that often gets mixed up with mentorship as well. And I think being explicit about separating those is also helpful, that like you'll get better mentorship if sponsorship is something different, and you'll get better sponsorship if mentorship is something different.
Can you define sponsorship?
Yeah. And I want to be clear, I'm talking about sponsorship specifically in kind of the corporate sense.
Yeah.
I'm also involved in sponsorship in the 12-step sense. And then that is something that is actually much closer to mentorship. But sponsorship in the corporate sense, in my experience, was really more around giving people opportunities and really using your personal leverage within an organization to give someone an opportunity that they would not have necessarily had just left to their own devices and left to the devices of their manager, right? So I sponsored someone who was like multiple levels of management in my hierarchy. There was like a manager and a director and then me, I think, at the time. And she absolutely deserved every single opportunity that she got, but it was just really accelerated by the fact that she didn't have to be going through layers of people. And again, this is coming back to that, what we discussed with the scope, is that with a much broader scope, what was possible for me was just a totally different universe than what might have seemed possible to her manager or even her manager's manager.
Yeah.
And it was nothing really dramatic. It was just like she got a lot of yeses from me.
Yeah.
Whereas from her manager, rightfully didn't want to commit to anything that was beyond their scope of control.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there was just so much more that was within my scope of control. I'd be like, yes, let's do this. Let's make this happen.
I know of a particular leader that I learned a lot from, and she was really effective with sponsorship. And it looked from the outside like basically she was taking risks with people. But her bets always paid off. And so it's like a very calculated, it was like almost like a bet, but she made it happen somehow.
I think a lot of this comes back to confidence. And a wise friend of mine years ago once asked me, he said, do you know what the difference is between arrogance and confidence? I said, I actually don't. And he said, arrogance means you come into a situation thinking that you know what the outcome will be. And confidence is believing that you can never know the outcome, but it will be okay.
Oh, wow. Interesting.
And I think that, this person that you mentioned who is really good at making these bets, I bet they worked out because she was confident, because she knew that even if this one particular thing maybe didn't work out the way that someone had envisioned it would be okay. Yeah. And that everybody was going to learn from it.
Yeah.
and that it wasn't going to be a terrible experience, right? It wasn't going to be something that would like scare someone off and make them not take risks later.
Yeah. And I think it was also like how she set it up. Like she would set up these basically, she's very deliberate about assessing where people were at and giving them something that felt like a stretch, but that she knew that person could handle. And this was Belinda Runkle. I feel like she had a very systematic approach to it. She'd look at all the people in her organization. She was like planting all these seeds everywhere. It was just really interesting to observe because I saw a few people out of her organization that just their careers just exploded faster than I had ever seen before. And they were incredible. They had incredible capabilities, but she helped make it happen. It was really interesting.
Yeah.
So the second topic you wanted to talk about today was about Conway's law and how it applies in rapidly growing organizations. Tell me about this. What is? Yeah. First of all, start with Conway's law. Some people may not be familiar with it.
I mean, Conway's law is originally from information science, so I'm not going to phrase it in its exact original wording, but the general gist of it is that organizations and the technical architecture that they maintain tend to converge, right? So if you have, let's say you're working in a microservice architecture, you tend to have a lot of teams that have their responsibilities are drawn along lines of this set of microservices, for example. Yeah. Whereas like if you're working in a monolith, like the boundaries of responsibility, if you have multiple teams, like one, it's hard to have multiple teams. And if you do, the boundaries of responsibility tend to be messier. Yeah. And sometimes more along like business lines. Oh, these are the people that work on the back office stuff. And these are the people that work on the front office stuff. And they're all in the same monolith. And I mean, it's interesting for me to observe it. And this is why I said I wanted to talk about it specifically within the context of rapidly growing teams, either in terms of rapidly growing business or rapidly growing actual number of people on a team, which obviously often go hand in hand, hopefully, because your architecture is just constantly changing. Right. Yesterday's technology won't serve you tomorrow. Yeah. And yet there's like a fair amount of inertia for good reason within your team structure. You don't want to be constantly reorging.
Yeah, people complain about that a lot.
For good reason. And so it's an interesting challenge, especially as the technical architecture, as the organization has grown to this point, that this starts to be more of a concern. You're probably in a place where the decision makers around the technical architecture and the organizational architecture may not be the same people. Or even if they are the same people, some of them are better at one side than the other, or just more concentrated on one side as opposed to the other. Yeah. So you can end up you'll make decisions that make a whole lot of sense for your technical architecture that cause you a whole lot of pain in your organizational architecture, or vice versa. Right? And it takes a long time for you to work through that. And then I think that in my experience, this is made much more acute in like a DevOps organization, in a DevOps environment, where the people who are developing the software are directly responsible for operationalizing and maintaining that software in a production environment. Because part of it is, again, a scaling issue where the amount of time and energy that you need to maintain and operationalize something may not grow proportionally with the amount of time and energy it takes to do the development work for those same set of responsibilities. And so you can end up with teams that like possibly they have just the right number of people to meet their development needs, but they're swamped from an operational perspective. Or you have a team that they have the sufficient bandwidth to meet their operational needs, but that's all they're doing because the development responsibilities are actually much smaller than the operational responsibilities. So you have people who they want to be developers, but they're effectively just operating because that's effectively what's called for. That's where the majority of the work is in their team.
So if you look at it from a macro level, you've got a company that is rapidly growing, this drives a lot of change in these different units of work. And the part of the problem is that there's so much change in where the people are, where the responsibilities are shifted between, that you don't have a very stable set of context for each of those teams. And so that can make it really hard to support things. It can slow those teams down. I'd be curious to hear like any sort of examples from your past of like how you navigated that.
Yeah, I wish I had more glowing slam dunk examples.
This is messy work. It's yeah.
A lot of it has been learning lessons the hard way. It's interesting you bring up this subject of different people having different contexts and potentially context being lost as teams get reorganized and as architecture changes. And I think that having a strong written culture and keeping that up to date, which again is just so incredibly difficult, and really as much as possible, and this is, I've yet to encounter an organization that does this really well, and I'm not pointing fingers, like I've been complicitous in this as well, is write down the why. Because I think a lot of what happens is teams get shuffled around in order to meet the needs of the changing architecture, and people very quickly lose track of the why.
Yeah.
And so you either end up reinventing the wheel in terms of like going back to technical decisions that were made in the past for a very good reason, or you have almost like a cargo cult kind of situation where people are like, just don't touch that. Yeah. Like that thing works. Just don't touch it. We don't know why it does things the way it does it. And those are not great situations.
Do you have any advice or like things you've learned from these situations that you would recommend to organizations to reduce the impact of or the pain as these companies grow?
Yeah. So one thing, and this comes back to what I was saying before around the people with the organizational knowledge and the people with the organizational power, really, to be frank, like the people who can make these organizational changes, not being the same people who have the technical know-how, is one piece of advice I would say is be transparent and collaborative in the reorg process, right? I think so many times reorgs are done as like this big bang that comes out of the head of one or two people. Yeah. And what they're doing makes perfect sense from like an HR perspective, but then for the people who are actually maintaining and building these systems, it makes no sense at all. Yeah. And it creates a lot of pain for them. Yeah. This is another one of those things. You said mentorship can get a bad rap. I think collaboration and transparency can also get a bad rap. I think it's helpful as a leader to talk to your team and say, hey, status quo is not going to work, and this is why. Yeah. And point to specific pain points that people have in their own lives. Be like, hey, remember when that thing blew up? Or remember when you had that really painful, drawn out argument with that other team because you had this shared responsibility? Like really point out, I'm not doing this for my own sake. Right. I'm not just doing this because I'm a middle manager and reorgs are what I do, which are people unfortunately believe that stuff. Yeah. Say, these are the kind of pain points that I'm trying to solve. Help me solve this. Yeah. So it doesn't become this exercise of someone from on high wants to make change and other people are like, please don't. Yeah. It's, hey, let's work together to solve this problem. This is what you get out of it, right? I'll be transparent and say, this is what I get out of it. Yeah. It's like, my managers don't have the right number of people to manage or whatever. Just be transparent with your own motivations as well. And I think you'll get a much better result. And also, this is a much like given change, right? Change incrementally as much as possible. Interesting. That's part of it, is change incrementally as much as possible. Be open and collaborative about the way that you do it. I think that big bang changes tend to have just so many unforeseen consequences, even when you are very transparent and collaborative about it. Yeah. And I think if you have a real honest open door policy about what is and isn't working, it's a lot easier to make those incremental changes. I like that a lot. I have had the experience of doing big bang changes that were actually excessively transparent. And because it was such a messy process, it really just stressed a lot of people out.
So I think maybe another factor is they have to be done fairly rapidly. So it's very intensive work sometimes to like assemble the right plan, do it in a way that you can communicate effectively and also get people on board with.
Absolutely. Yeah. It's a pretty classic example of change management. I think that one of the things that makes this particular flavor of change so stressful to people is you're changing who they work with on a day-to-day basis. And that is the number one thing.
That's what people care about more than anything. Yeah.
Yeah. More than their manager.
Yeah.
Like more than who their company is doing business with, to some extent, like sometimes even more than like the financial health of their company, as long as they can continue to get paid. It's all about who do I work with on a day-to-day basis.
Totally agree with that. Yeah.
And if someone's just going to come and move their cheese, right, it is stressful. And you're right, even with a really high level of transparency, hanging on the precipice for a long time and being in that awkward in-between phase where you're like, should I start hanging out with my new team or should I still be, or do I do both? It's really, it can be very stressful.
Interesting. Do you have any experiences that you'd like to share as you've navigated this in the past? I know you've done some kind of interesting experiments.
I think the one thing I'll share is there'll always be some aspect that you'll regret, right? There'll always be at least one team that you're like, ooh, yeah, like in hindsight, that was not a great charter. Like that's feeling like a junk drawer kind of team that we like showed too much stuff. And don't be afraid to make more changes, right? And it's, again, we're getting into kind of some of these classic change management challenges where it's like, people don't want to see changes just dribbled out over and over again. That's really unsettling. That creates a really high level of anxiety when you're like never really confident that change has ceased. Yeah. But at the same time, can't be rigid, right? If it's really heavyweight and it takes a really long time for you to execute the change, everyone's exhausted and you're just like, okay, just the change is done. I can just go back to reading memos all day or whatever. But actually, that's the most critical time, right? It's just like coming out with a major new release of your software, right? Like you pushed so hard to get this release out and you just want to kick back, but nope, actually, like this is the time when you need to be most aware of what's going on. The exact same thing is true of changing teams. It's like, really pay attention because there's going to be people who are stressed, and they're actually like the people who are being stressed by this are probably going to be less transparent about it than you would hope that they would be, because they just don't want more change. They're just like, can we not keep reorging? Yeah. Right? It's like, this kind of sucks, but I'm just going to stick with it because I don't want to reorg again. And you have to like get it out of them a little bit and be like, really? Is it really okay?
Yeah. It's funny that you make the analogy between releasing software and doing organizational change. One kind of random idea I've toyed with in the past has been to actually make that a lot more explicit and be like, okay, this is version 3.1 of our organization that we're releasing. Here are the changes and why we're doing it. And we're going to do a big 4-point release because we're doing this big reorg. And we learned some things during the reorg, so we're going to have a 4.01 like emergency release because, that was a bad decision. I've sometimes wondered if managers would communicate better if they use some sort of structure like that.
Yeah, well, and I think that there's some level of telegraphing to it, right? Is that we all understand how versioning works, and we all understand that there's always going to be a very fast follow-on to every major release. And yeah, I think it really sets that tone.
Yeah.
It would, I should say. I haven't experienced it, but I would imagine it would set the tone.
I haven't actually done it, so I'd be curious if somebody has done that experiment. It seems like a fun thing to try. Well, Keizan, can you tell us how to find you on the internet and...
Yes, definitely. One of the easiest ways to find me is on LinkedIn, but I also have my own website. It's brightmountain.com, but mountain is spelled MNTN, which is why I say maybe you should just look me up on LinkedIn, but you can also go to Bright Mountain one word. And right now I'm a fractional engineering leader. I also do coaching and advising, but I also just doing a lot of networking just to get to know more people and taking advantage of the fact that my schedule is more flexible to be able to do stuff like this and hang out with some of my favorite people.
Oh, thank you. What are examples of problems that people come to you for help with?
That's a great question. So far, a lot of people have come to me with career development has been a big thing that people have come to me, and across the spectrum of folks that are already leaders who are like in a job search for the first time in a long time, but even early career engineers who really want to grow. My ideal person to work with as like a coach and advisor is someone who really wants to grow and really realizes that in order to grow professionally, they're probably going to need to grow personally as well. I'm not a quote unquote life coach, and no, life coaches are very valuable and important, but I want to be a career coach, but who is also willing and able to talk to people about their life. And yeah, I'm about just growing and maturing across the board. So I tend to just naturally attract people who are looking for that. And it's really pretty similar in the leadership work that I do, that it's about maturity, and it's about that organization that has gotten us here but won't get us there. And it's not necessarily clear what good looks like at that more mature level, and how do you get from point A to point B.
Charity Majors recently had a post where she talked about how one of the nicest benefits of leadership is that it has so much applicability to your growth as a person as well. And I've felt that for a very long time. And I just love how she brought up that point. It really resonated with me. There's a lot of transference between personal and leadership that I really appreciate.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. And this has been a lot of fun. I learned a lot.
Yeah.
And we covered a lot of great topics.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thanks, Jay.
Thank you so much for joining me today and joining Keizan as we discussed these topics. I would really appreciate any feedback on the show. Please tell your friends about it if you think they'd like it. And also, if you're able to leave a rating for the podcast on whatever platform you're using, that really helps me out. Have a great day. Thank you.